Hi, and welcome to The Existential Coach. On this episode, I'm going to talk about the way we rationalize violence. And I'm going to make a distinction between the process of rationalizing something and the process of reasoning something. And the distinction I'm going to make is significant in how we create our relationship to meaning, and therefore how we create our relationship to violence. So the way I'm using the term rationalization here is to illustrate the times where we come up with reasons after we have the answer that we want to support. So we are reverse engineering an answer to something that we've already made. So that's how I'm using the term rationalism, to rationalize something in the context of this podcast and in the context of the argument that I'm making, is that this is when we rationalize a pre-existing position, belief, view, and so on. By contrast, reason is something that as yet has no answer and ultimately never has an answer, which is to say, reason is the process of reasoning things where the goal, if we want to use that term, is not to obtain an answer, but to get better questions. So one way to think of this is, and now I'm kind of breaking this down, is on the one hand, we have a kind of closed approach. So we're rationalizing something based upon an idea, a concept, a belief, and so on that we already have. And on the other hand, we have this open system, which is we're never actually going to come to a fixed answer. And so in that way, we are continuing the discussion, continuing the exploration. And we are using reason as a kind of conceptual propulsion system that allows us to venture into the unknown. Whereas rationalizing is a way for us to reverse engineer situations so we can create meaning. Now, I want to make clear that I'm not saying one is good, one is bad. In the same way that I don't think a hammer is good and a screwdriver is bad, or a screwdriver is good and a hammer is bad. These are, following that analogy, simply tools, conceptual tools that we have. So there may be times when reverse engineering something, when rationalizing something, is a way for us to substantiate something that we don't have an answer for yet. So we're, in that way, reverse engineering. So we're looking for something for whatever reason after the fact. For example, something bad can happen to us, whatever that is, and we can say it's because I didn't do this, I didn't do that, I should have believed more, I should have, and we can put it on ourselves and create this kind of pressure upon ourselves to change the way we act, which may or may not be relevant. It may be the case that we're actually just creating a form of shame for ourselves that isn't really factually relevant. However, it does give us the illusion of control, and we've talked about that at different times throughout the podcast. So there is this need to try and get an understanding of a situation that we don't have an understanding of. And that creates a sense of certainty in the midst of uncertainty. So we're experiencing chaos, we're experiencing a great deal of uncertainty, and we create a reason to say, well, that's why that happened. Now, the quality of those rationalizations are a separate point, but that we needed to have some answer speaks to the fact that it can be more important to have an answer than to have an answer that is particularly helpful or robust or even true. And so if that's the case, if we have the capacity to essentially come up with answers to situations, and the quality of that answer is not particularly robust, that's actually a skill, right? Because that means we can operate in ways without really having a clear idea of what we're doing. We can kind of, I'm going to, in a way, put duct tape on that and put a pin in that, and I'm going to put an X to marks variable for that. In other words, we can create a way to continue to exist even though we actually don't have sound answers. And that can be a very helpful way for us to create a conceptual structure of our situation, particularly ones that are overwhelming. So in the case of, or the example of me saying it's because it's my fault, really what I'm doing is I'm, in a psychological way, I'm engaging in a form of repression, suppression. I'm using an internalization process to say, okay, the crisis that has happened externally is because of what I could have done internally. Therefore, I'm gaining a semblance of control through the notion that next time I will change my behavior, and that means I will avoid this negative situation. So one kind of simple example might be missing a plane and not setting an alarm, or not setting a second alarm, or whatever it is that you think would help you to actually catch that plane. And so you tell yourself, well, I missed the flight, but next time what I'm going to do is I'm going to have a friend call me, or I'm going to do this, or I'm going to do that. And now I know that it'll be okay for next time. You actually do not know, right? There's nothing factual about this information at all. You may miss the next flight, the next time you fly. Similarly, with any example, is you don't actually know, but the rationalization gives you the pretense that you do know. So that's really helpful in terms of how we understand our relationship to the unknown. Now, as you can probably foretell, this can only go so far, because if everything is reverse engineered, we're walking through every door backwards. And it might work for a time, but at some point, we might start to think, well, what would it be like to engage in a process where I welcome uncertainty? I have a dialogue with uncertainty. In fact, what would it be like to engage in a process where uncertainty becomes a dynamic of potential that can carry new understanding, new experiences, and do so in a manner that actually liberates me from the tyranny of my rationalizations, which is to say the notion that I have to reverse engineer everything, even though these may not be particularly sound rationalizations. And so now, thinking about reason, we start getting into these questions of, well, how do we kind of peel back the layers of the onion? How do we look for not an answer, but a new question? And to a certain extent, this is really all this podcast series is. I start with a point and I see where it takes me. And it's more akin to an improvisation insofar as I'm starting from a point of departure. There's no script. I just start with an idea and I try to peel the layers. And at some point, after about 30 minutes, I stop. Usually I cadence in some way, which speaks to a kind of subjective form, an implicit form, you could say, an implicit bias that exists within how I'm structuring the container of my thought, that it will end at some point, and it's going to be this 30-minute kind of chunk. And whatever reason is obtained or can be obtained, or whatever questions can be explored, whatever rationalizations are given, it's going to happen within the container of this 30-minute podcast. The reason why that's significant is it starts to speak to the way in which our information is structured within something beyond either a rationalization or a reasoning process. Yet we can become very focused on our rationalizations of things, i.e. looking back and reverse engineering it, or our reasons for things, i.e. engaging in a process whereby the unknown is something that we, like a horizon we walk into, but we still can't see because every step towards a horizon just means the horizon moves. So each question begets another question, which begets another question, and so on. And so we have this container. In the case of this podcast, we have this 30-minute container. Now, you might be wondering, well, what does this have to do with violence?
I move that, in the opinion of this House, the Government of Ontario should consult with the public and its partners in the family court system to promote and ensure the availability of continuing education seminars for professionals in Ontario's family court system, such as judges, justices of the peace, Crown attorneys, custody assessors, and social workers on matters related to intimate partner violence and coercive control in intimate partner and family relationships.
Kira's law, and this bill that's proposed, is about educating, as was indicated, judges, social workers, people in the legal profession beyond the judge, of course lawyers and so on, to think differently about violence against women. Now, one of the things that happens when we think about violence is we have this implicit response to try and take control of what the violent situation is and to try and understand the reasons for the violence. And the reason why I spent so much time laying out the question of rationalizing something versus reasoning something, I think will now come into focus. When we think about violence against women and we make clear the distinction between the rationalizing process of violence against women and the reasoning process of violence against women, it starts to become pretty obvious that what we're doing is rationalizing violence against women, that they have done something, that there is some kind of quote-unquote natural law or whatever it is that mitigates the culpability of us as a society to acknowledge that violence against women is not something to rationalize, to reverse engineer, to say the abuse has taken place, the violence, murder has taken place, and we will then say, well, that's because of whether it's some anomaly or it's because of some structural issue. In other words, moving away from the fact that we are operating in a system that continues to rationalize the violence against women, the violence against intimate partners, in a way that discounts the responsibility of society. So, just briefly, if we think about the word responsible, really what we're talking about is the ability to respond. And I've talked about this before. So the question is what implicit structures do we have and how able are they to respond? So the reason why I was belaboring the point about my 30-minute podcast is to say that it was the container. Whatever reason happens within this is going to happen within this time frame. So right now we're at about 12-ish minutes. So you know that you've got about roughly 18 minutes left. That whatever's going to happen is going to happen in that 18 minutes. So whatever truth is going to come out of this podcast is going to come out in 18 minutes. And anything that doesn't fit into those 18 minutes are not included. By analogy, when we start to look at justice in the court system and intimate partner violence, violence against women, and we start to look for justice, we start to look for truth, we start to look for the rebalancing, or I shouldn't even say the rebalancing, the balancing of interpersonal dynamics that do not exclude the right and freedom of anyone to be able to exist in a safe and connected way without the fear and terror of being attacked and or killed. And adding to this, the fear and the terror that their child can be operationalized as a pawn within this violent dynamic, within the structure of the justice system, that can make not only the child's life irrelevant, and not only the mother's life, the woman's life irrelevant, but also sustain a form of rationalizing our interpersonal dynamics that will only lead to more violence, which is to say, if we look at this on a macro level, it is an implicit rationalization of violence. And I'm approaching it this way in this podcast because when you zoom in on a person's story and you feel frustrated or mad or you feel sad or emotional about it, you can say, well, that's wrong. But care without action is not sufficient to engage the necessary change to reasonably address the crisis of violence against women, the crisis of intimate partner violence. And the conditions by which we can and do perpetuate this implicit structure is something that if we don't look at, we will only move the furniture around, but not in a robust way, move to a kind of thinking that moves away from rationalizing a situation that we do not yet have the understanding of in a robust way, and instead move into a form of reasoning which understands we do not know. So one of the criticisms that happen when we start talking about intimate partner violence and violence against women is people say, well, what about men? It's not unlike the argument that you heard where people, Black Lives Matter, and people say, well, all lives matter, or blue lives matter in reference to police officers and so on and so forth. Now, this is a sidestep, right? You can say, oh, well, there is no such thing as racism because there's no such thing as race. Really what we're talking about is oppression. Or you could say people in one country have it worse than another. So why are the people in the country that have it better than the country that things are worse in, why are they complaining so much? But all of that's avoidance, right? All of that is avoiding the fact that there is this implicit bias going on. There is this form of rationalizing going on, and this is complicit in that form of rationalization. So what this means, when we start to parse apart the intimate partner violence question, when we start to parse apart the violence against women question, and we don't look at the system itself. We don't look at, well, what is actually happening that is sexist, not is kind of sexist, not is sort of sexist, but if we operate from the premise, we currently have a sexist, misogynistic system, and we start from there, then all of a sudden the thinking starts to shift. But we're moving away from rationalization. We're moving into the realm of reason, because in the realm of reason, you start from these kinds of statements. You say, well, what if there's a planet, and on that planet, when women and men separate, there's genders we call women and men, and when they separate and have a child, they go to court. And when that happens, the interest of the court is to ensure that both parents have equal rights. Because the view is a child is 50% property of the parents. Therefore, no parent can have more control than another, because the child as property is therefore to be split between these parents. And we might think, looking at this planet, well, that's kind of strange because kids can't be 50%. You can't really have a 50% child, right? You can't really split things up in that way. What an interesting and strange world that is, that they think you can just take a child, and then conceptualize the understanding of that child as something that can be divided abstractly into an amount, and that can be parsed out and then handed to different people who are owners of that child. The idea being here is just through the approach of reason, we see that okay, well, maybe there's a fundamental flaw here, right, in the premise. The idea that a child can be split is already deeply problematic. The idea of 50% ownership is already deeply problematic. The idea that each parent should have equal access or equal control is already problematic. Add to this, on this planet, we notice that some men use the child and the access they have based upon the entitlement of 50% to then control the other person. Well, the problem with that, and I hope it's somewhat obvious, is, well, that's not even a property division. Now it's somebody using another being, their child, to operationalize a relationship with somebody else, their ex, and do it in a way that allows them to keep control over that person, which means they're able to use their share, so to speak, in a way to gain control over other people. And we might look at the people on that planet and say, well, this doesn't even seem like 50-50 is working within their construct, because if the idea is we're splitting everything down the middle and everybody just goes home, they would like to have more, but they don't get it and they're kind of upset about it. But everybody got 50 and everybody walked away. They don't even have that. What they actually have is a system whereby somebody can utilize their share to create control and manipulations that are projected onto somebody else. So just by walking through those steps, it starts to seem increasingly insane. It starts to seem increasingly insane that the way in which we would base our thinking on a child, on, in this case, custody of the child, is on splitting the child into what we are calling 50-50 or whatever the cut is, and then enacting principles that need to be met. And this is where we get into reverse engineering or rationalizing violence. Because it's only when we have the premise that each party has equal access that we can then justify the acts of violence that arise. People saying, well, whoa, that seems like a bit of a leap. How did we get from 50-50 property rights of a child to violence over the other person? Well, because implicit within that is a person is allowed to have control over their 50%. Even when they're at the other person's house, or if there's shared interest, what school they go to, the doctor they see, if they go to church, if they don't go to church, if it's okay, if they, let's say in terms of gender questions, one parent might say, no, it's not okay for them to come out. The other parent might say it is okay for them to come out. So you can start to see that a condition of conflict is actually embedded into the relationship, which is the implicit act of violence, which is then rationalized under the auspices of, well, everybody gets 50%. Each parent, each party gets 50%. And so in doing that, what we have done is we've created the container for violence. And because we can't leave that situation, because we are trapped within it, we are now engaged in a rationalization process of violence. It is not a process of reasoning. The reason, paradoxically, why that matters when we start talking about the court system is we have to ask ourselves, well, what function is or does a court have? And the simple answer is they are not an instrument of reason. They are an instrument of rationale because the laws are created that the court then rationalizes. That's why lawyers come up with different arguments. They try and create new precedents through how they argue, bring in different pieces of information, different experts, blah, 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 blah. And they do it in a way that fundamentally propels their point of view, their perspective. Of course, operating in the interest of their position, and that is operating in the interest of their client. Now, what this means is they are playing an adversarial role within this space of 50-50. So their goal is to say, well, I'm trying to get 51, 52, 53%, 54, 60%. But the adversarial structure that is there is completely negating things like the child. And when I say things like the child, it's because the child is now a thing. And everybody is talking about it as a thing. So when a child is impacted, when a partner is impacted, the understanding is, well, there's not really much we can do about it because everybody has 50%, unless there's extraneous circumstances or unless you can prove that there is some form of threat, some form of danger. But this is where we all kind of back ourselves through the door again. The problem we face here is as we get into this thinking of, well, you have to then prove that this person could do these dangerous things. Well, what do we actually know? We know we have a system that has a bias towards making the child property of the parents that is split through this abstract division, this counting system, 50-50 or whatever the number is. And it already has to rationalize the validity of that, which means it has to say, well, it's for the betterment of the child. which is not really based on anything. It's just other than property rights, and avoiding, and this is key, avoiding a fundamental blind spot, which is if you treat everything like it's a 50% or whatever it is property rights issue, you lose the nuance that, well, what if somebody is violent? What if somebody is manipulative? And you say, well, parents shouldn't be like that, or whatever it is that you say. But we know that that's not the case, right? We know that people do become really hurt. We know that people are frustrated, are angry. We know that we then rationalize our position to try and better our place, and then that's criticized. The other side will say, well, you're rationalizing your position, and then we say that they're rationalizing their position. And none of this is getting us to any reasoned place. So in a sense, what's happening is we're kind of going round and round and round and round because we can't actually face a deeper truth. And that deeper truth is not entirely unobvious, but we don't have the structure to engage with it. So the deeper truth is connection, right? The deeper truth is we are actually all connected. We are all responsible to one another, that we are actually all in a society together, that the rights of a child, the rights of a parent, the rights of both parents are not simply, if we're only expressed through the notion of property rights, actually diminish what our rights are. So if we think about it in terms of, does the man think he has the right to control his ex through the child? And is he able to manipulate society in such a way that, and rationalizing, right, reverse engineering things, she's this, she's that, blah, 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 blah. And I've heard the craziest things, I've got to say, where the things that a mother has done to try and ensure the sense of safety and security, which by any other standard would be seen as clearly that, are turned as, well, that's just the mother trying to make themselves look good. That's just the mother trying to make themselves have control. In other words, the male is projecting on, and I say male in this situation because in the situations that I've heard most about, there has been this almost radical projecting onto the woman all of the things the man lacks that are utterly incoherent. Now, some listeners might find this really frustrating. I mean, now, I'm trying to think, the man is this, the woman is that. And I'll come back to this in a moment. I'll kind of loop around a bit. But if we go back to this idea of I'm on another, I'm looking at a culture on another planet, and I'm noticing how the man seems to be kind of desperate, right? That they're attacking. They feel like they need to try and get some kind of control. They want to make sure that they have certain decision-making rights over very specific things or all things. And they feel, and looking at them as if they're on another planet, it seems like they're afraid that they're losing whatever it is that they thought they had. And this plays into the underlying implicit structure, the implicit bias of ownership, that they thought they had ownership over a way of existing in the world that placed them in a position of authority where they implicitly had these rights to make these claims. And we know this is the case because in its extreme form, it results in the man feeling that he can beat the woman, beat the child, kill the woman, kill the child. And it can result in the man taking his own life. And what that suggests is the profound hopelessness the man feels when he doesn't have the kind of control that he thinks he needs to have. And he reverse engineers, he rationalizes his violence, not as something that is violence, not as something that is controlling, manipulative, narcissistic, and so on and so forth. Rather, it is what he needs to do. And if we don't unpack the way in which we rationalize violence as a form of identity, which is to say it's a form of understanding a dynamic within a relationship, and this is where we can shift. Because yes, it could apply in the reverse, but the dynamic remains the same. And because we're in a system that is misogynistic, it is clearly skewing to males attacking women at a way bigger number than the other way. So that's why the arguments of saying, well, what about men, are kind of absurd, because the structure is such that it actually creates the container within which the form of oppression that I'm talking about right now is intimate partner violence, as men being violent towards women and children. So if we think about this in the context of rationalization and reason, and we think about this in the context of our relationship to uncertainty and identity, this is where we get into the complicity of the society, including the court system. So what do I mean by this? Well, a structure has to be in place that enables any form of dialectical process to seem reasonable in whatever way. So that means, in the same way that the space within the pot is space, it's actually all that we use when we cook, right? It's that without the space, the pot becomes useless. Similarly, here is the container for rationalizing violence is the way in which our society operates. We justify it all the time. We justify not listening. We justify being intolerant. I mean, here's a couple of kind of smaller examples. In Toronto, there's this thing about the super mayor or whatever they're calling it, where the mayor would not need to have as many votes to have a majority consensus. So the criticism against that, I think quite obviously, is, well, this means you don't really have to listen to everybody, which means you don't really have a democracy. So that's one of the things that happens. Similarly, in psychotherapy, I've heard therapists say, well, I've got a client who doesn't just want talk therapy. The idea there being that talking isn't really relevant. Really, they want results-oriented things. The paradox, the irony being, it's all talk therapy. It doesn't matter if it's a cognitive model or whatever it is. It still involves talking. The question is what is the quality of the conversation? Are we engaging in rationalizing a position, or are we engaged in reasoning a position? So those are just two kind of simple examples. But if we start to apply that to intimate partner violence, and we say we actually have a structure of implicit violence where people can rationalize their abuse and their actions, and that goes both ways. A person who is abused can say, well, I deserved it. I did the wrong thing. If I change my behavior, if I X, so on and so forth. But what that is doing ultimately, it is creating a container that normalizes the rationalization of violence, which is in and of itself this response that is completely and utterly incoherent. So I have gone over the 30 minutes. And what I'm struck by is how, frustrated I am, clearly. And I'm frustrated because a part of me wonders, what is it about us that seeks an answer even when it's so problematic? That we're looking for the courts, or we're looking for police, or we're looking for whatever it is to give us an answer. And I think, is that going to break the context within which we are facing this rationalization of violence? That we normalize violence to such an extent, we see it as so inevitable, that can we even step outside of it for long enough to realize that, for example, a child is not something that can be abstractly divided by percentage points. That's just not how it is for a human being's experience. And if we start to challenge this notion of not only the parents as essential to, because the argument, the court fundamentally is a child needs both parents. Well, let's say for a second that's 1000% true. Well, then why isn't it true that the child needs a society? It needs a community to protect the child. to nurture the child, to support the child, to ensure the continuity of care as the child grows into their own individual expressive being? Why are we stopping with mom and dad? If it's such an important thing, if 50-50 is so important, why aren't we saying everybody is responsible to the child? Not just the mother, not just the father. Why are we making, and this plays into the point that I'm saying about rationalizing violence, why are we playing this out like it's a drama between two people fighting over territory? Like it's a sitcom or a TV show or a book or whatever it is, and not seeing it as, okay, if that is the case, then are we not, each and every one of us, not only responsible, but accountable to the role in which we play as a core, fundamental, foundational caregiver to a child, to a family? So if we pick sides, if we make it about 50-50 this, have we not skated away from, skipped out on what we are responsible for as community members? And this is what I kind of keep on coming back to with the way in which we rationalize violence, is we're coming up with a reason that means we don't have to engage. We don't have to deal with these difficult questions, these difficult issues, these paradoxical enactments that are going on as we see violence and intimate partner violence continue and escalate. We saw it during COVID, and we see it when the structure of society creates extra or more pressure. We see how that has this impact on families. So we know that families are impacted by community. We know that. Yet, are we actually talking about that fundamental implicit structure which encourages, I would say even demands, a form of rationalization that validates violence without taking responsibility to say, this is an unreasonable act. We are perpetuating a form of rationalization because we have been unwilling to break down the implicit structure, the container that we currently have that doesn't allow us to get to the next reasonable step. And just as I've broken the container of this episode, can we break the container of how we understand intimate partner violence, how we understand that our child is not 50% this, 50% that? Can we break down the way in which we implicitly think the justice system is actually going to give us justice, as in it's going to hear or see or validate us? Can we actually break down the fact that this container is not sufficient for the kind of interconnected, interpersonal community accountability, community responsibility that we have to each other? And to rationalize violence is to put up a barrier and say, that's not my problem. So I'll leave it there. I hope at the very least this has been a way to start thinking a little bit about how we may have certain assumptions about, for example, what the justice system does, or certain assumptions about, dividing a kid in half, 50-50, and all this kind of stuff, and starts to encourage a conversation that says, okay, well, what are the implicit things we think? What is the win in this situation? What is the actual goal in this situation? And start to challenge some of these containers and say, well, maybe these containers aren't robust enough, aren't coherent enough, aren't relevant enough. And so as a result, we need to start taking steps into the unknown. We need to start engaging in a process of reason, because we need to start exploring the way in which we can address the issues that we do not actually fully understand, and that the habits of the past are not going to give us enough light to move along whatever trajectory we have as we go forward. So until next time, bye for now.